Vietnam War protests, from a cracked nation to a coherent one. In the 1960s and 70s, America was involved in the Vietnam War, and many members of the baby boomer generation began protesting America's involvement. Their new ideology brought America into a new cultural age, and in doing so, changed American society. The Vietnam War, America's effort to end the spread of communism. Both sides have agreed to split at the 17th parallel north of the equator. The North is under the rule of the Communist Viet Cong, and the South is under democratic French rule and is receiving aid from the United States. This war took 58,318 American lives throughout the 13 years of the nation's involvement, and the government took a lot of fire from its citizens because many of them did not want to enter the war from the start. On March 8, 1965, the first U.S. boots touched the ground in Vietnam, and just 2 weeks later, over 2,500 college students performed a teach-in at the University of Michigan, with 35 other universities following. This was the first example of college students voicing their opinions peacefully, but also willing to stand up and fight their nation if necessary. This triggers many mini-protests around the nation, including marches on the nation's capital, where 25,000 people marched through the streets of the city, almost matching the number of American soldiers fighting in the war at that time. The first year of protests brings the rise of anti-war groups and locations for rallies and protests. One major group acting as ringleader is the SDS, or the Students for a Democratic Society. They held many of their rallies in three main locations: New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco. A big reason for that is because there is a college located in all of these cities that have many liberal students protesting the war, which will eventually cause these cities to have major clashes with their college students. Throughout 1966 and 1967, many full-scale riots and protests break out across the nation. 100,000 people marched to the United Nations building in New York, as well as riots breaking out in 7 different cities. These riots call the attention from the national government to take the domestic protests more seriously because residents are beginning to cause mass destruction. Stop the Draft Week organized at the University of California, Berkeley, which is a safe haven for many anti-war activists. Their target is the Oakland Army Induction Center. They wanted to stop inductees from getting out of the city. Over a 4-day period, they got 10,000 marchers in the city and began to sit in the streets, completely blocking all traffic and commutes through the city. These marches were met by police officers that treated them brutally, and this was known as the first peaceful protest that was met by violent authority. A popular activist in the anti-war protest is known for his role in the civil rights movement. In the speech, he calls for people to step out of the silence and to stand up for what they believe in.
Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak.
This got many African Americans and civil rights supporters to begin protesting the war so that they could begin doing what their role model is doing. A big national group that was formed in 1967 by 6 Vietnam War veterans is the VVAW, or the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. The men who started this group handed in their medals and honorable discharge papers. During their protests, they were treated the same as the other civilians, and many of them were sent to the hospital due to them being beaten by the police. Another major protest was done at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dow Chemical, a company manufacturing chemical weapons, specifically napalm, which causes severe burns, were on the campus attempting to recruit students to assist them in industrializing. A voice from both war supporter Bob Lawrence and activist Jane Maddell explained their sights and experiences.
I remember that the protesters started yelling at the sheriff's deputies and chanting "Sieg Heil." A lot of those Dane County Sheriff's deputies, I'm pretty sure, were World War II veterans, and that was just not something you did to a World War II veteran, to yell "Sieg Heil" at them. The chant of the very people they fought against in Germany. and France during World War II, and those sheriff's deputies reacted accordingly. They basically charged the students. It became more of a police riot than a student protest, and it was really ugly. Memory of that is still burned in my mind.
I remember how angry we all were that the United States was dropping napalm on children in Vietnam, and Dow Chemical Company was making it, and the University of Wisconsin was allowing Dow Chemical to come and recruit students on campus. Everybody was so angry, and that's what caused this demonstration. We were just so angry that our country was doing this and that Madison was allowing this company who was murdering people to recruit people from the student body to go do this again.
Many older people began to protest the war because activists began showing pictures of Vietnamese babies with disabilities due to napalm. Another school that showed a revolutionary act was when over 1,000 black and white students at Columbia University overran 5 administration buildings, showing to the nation that they would rather integrate and work together than have the nation in Vietnam. The protests suddenly turned violent when authorities began to break down windows and doors to enter the buildings, and many people were injured by a stampede to exit the building. In January of 1969, Richard Nixon was sworn in as president on a campaign promise that he would remove the troops from Vietnam. However, when he announced on April 30th, 1970, that he would spill the war into Cambodia, many students at a university in Ohio began to protest, and their demonstrations got the Ohio National Guard involved. On May 2nd, the National Guard arrived at Kent State due to the college students allegedly burning the ROTC building on campus. For the next 2 days, the Guard would disrupt protests by driving their jeeps and throwing tear gas into the crowds. However, the determined students showed up again on May 4th. After a frustrating battle, the guardsmen gave up on tear gas and decided to open fire upon the students. Everyone fled from the scene in terror and began to hide in anywhere they could find. By the end of the gun show, 4 students were killed and 9 others were injured. You could hear about the protests from a local resident who was on site during the shooting.
It's the American way. We're supposed to be able to voice our opinions and have group demonstrations, and this was supposed to be a peaceful demonstration, and if the guardsmen hadn't been there, I don't think there would have been any violence. That wasn't the point. It was to bring people together to protest the violence that's going on the other side of the world and the involvement of American kids over there put in a position where they have to follow orders. And they don't even understand why.
This one event left a lasting effect on the American people when the nation's own military gunned down college students attempting to demonstrate a peaceful protest. The result left college students around the nation on edge, and over 100 universities shut down for the next week due to riots and protests. By January of 1973, the war was at a stalemate, and President Nixon came to an agreement with Viet Cong to free all prisoners of war and to send the American troops home. The people got what they wanted. The troops were pulled out of Vietnam. By March, the U.S. troops came home. However, things were not the same when they got back. Many veterans were not treated with the same respect the World War II veterans received upon their return, and many of them were left with Vietnam Syndrome, which today we know as PTSD, as well as over 75,000 soldiers being severely disabled. The protesters treated the veterans with disrespect because they believed that they supported the very concept of the war, and therefore many Vietnam veterans were not welcome home at all. The coming of age of the baby boomer generation was much different than any other. With the height of the Cold War and technological advancement, the culture of America has been changed, and the anti-war activists promoted a new free speech and peaceful way of life that is common today as opposed to the traditional pre-war lifestyle. And after the war, the nation was unified after fighting for the same ideals and working together to rebuild from a cracked nation to a coherent one.